I'm Gina Bell, and I'm a storyteller. This is Hank, Bob, and Something Tremendously Odd. It's been illustrated by Andre Adams and written and narrated by myself, Gina Bell. Please enjoy. There once was a man named Bob who was driving home all alone in the fog. Bob didn't like driving alone in this weather. He thought he would like it. He would like it much better if he was at home on his couch wearing his favorite purple wool sweater. Then Bob saw a sign and a smile crossed his lips. Just 200 more miles till the end of this long, foggy trip. Yes, that sign, that wonderful sign simply stated, "You've but 200 miles till you reach the town of Moosefeather," which to Bob simply meant there was but 200 miles till he reached the end of all this awfully foggy weather. In his excitement, Bob sped. He sped up his car and unknowingly ran over the remains of old Lady Parsons' mayonnaise jar. A mere 20 minutes before, though she drove quite slowly, she had hit a large pothole and just kept on going. Her broken trunk latch, about which to a nice mechanic she had earlier spoken and had made an appointment to get it unbroken, had finally popped open. Out of her trunk the jar sailed, only to find itself in Bob's tire impaled. Though he was but 200 miles from his couch and his favorite purple wool sweater, he knew he had to pull over to see what was the matter. Bob stopped and hopped out of his car, but in all that fog he just couldn't see very far. Now 200 miles seemed awfully far while standing in the cold fog outside of his car. Bob looked around, and way off in the distance he saw a small twinkling light and thought maybe someone there might be of some assistance. Bob smiled to himself and walked through the fog and into the night, all the while hoping there were nice people to go with this small twinkling light. The closer he got, the more that darn fog it began to clear, and he saw a small house with a doormat that read, "Nice people always welcome here." Bob let out a small sigh as he reached out his index to give the doorbell a try. Bob waited nervously with a bad case of jitters. The man stuck out his hand to give Bob's a quick shake and said, "Hello there, my friend. Come on in. I've just baked a ridiculously moist angel food cake." Bob wiped his feet and took himself a seat while his new friend brought him something truly delicious to eat. Turns out, to make a long story short, the man's name was Hank, and he had lived out there in the middle of nowhere since birth. Hank was a very nice older man, though he seemed a bit lonely. Bob couldn't remember being anywhere that felt any more homey. The two men talked long into the night. They talked almost till morning's first light. Bob could feel his eyes starting to close, so he thanked Hank repeatedly for the hospitality he had showed. Then Hank leaned in quite close to Bob's ear, and he whispered a question that seemed very queer. Thinking he must have heard wrong, Bob politely said, "Excuse me?" Hank cleared his throat and then asked again, "Hey, Bob, you want to see something tremendously odd?" Bob hesitantly agreed and stood to follow Hank's lead. Hank walked through the front door and into the back, where he removed a small throw rug and opened an almost invisible hatch. "Down the hatch," Hank said as he giggled. They began their descent down through the almost invisible hatch. Bob heard Hank striking a match. Hank reached up and lit a small candle. Hank held on to it by its golden ring-like handle. They continued their walk down many stairs, which looked like they were in need of a few repairs. They walked some more through a long, thin corridor, and Bob thought it looked as if it had been made especially for Hank, just tall enough so he wouldn't have to bend, but too thin for Bob to see past him to this hallway's end. Bob followed, finding himself strangely curious. "Relax," Hank said. "Bob, don't be so serious. I know you must find this mysterious. It's just up here, but let's stop for a moment so I can make the rule clear. You see, some find the mere sight of him shocking. This I wanted to say before we continue walking. There is only one rule, and it's not hard to remember, but I must make it clear before you, Bob, become a member." "A member?" Bob asked as his voice began to quiver. "Bob," Hank began, "now don't let me lose you. I need to be sure that I haven't confused you." Then he stopped for a moment and looked deep into Bob's eyes before he continued his rule diatribe. "Just one rule to remember before I make you a member of this special club that very few will ever enter. You cannot, must not, you will not touch him." Can you remember that, Bob? It's really the only thing I need to mention. Now, before Bob had even a chance to reply, Hank continued again. "Bob, now listen here," he said, once again getting quite close to Bob's ear. "You must not touch him in any way. Don't poke him. For heaven's sake, don't hug him. I have to know that I have been clear. I must know before I let you enter in here. I want you to know that I have brought you here for only one reason, and it is that I think you might like to see him. This is a club that has very few members. Only 21 have ever entered. Only 21 people in the world have ever seen him. If you can tell me for sure that you can remember the rule, then you, Bob, will be lucky number 22. With that said, Bob nodded a hesitant yes, and Hank stood aside so Bob could finish this quest. At the end of the hall, Bob saw a very dim light, and like a moth to a flame, he walked to it that night. The closer he got, the more he could see. It was something truly amazing, and that is a fact to which no one could possibly disagree. At the end of that hallway and behind bars of thick steel sat something so strange that it must have, to Bob, seemed most unreal. He might not have believed his own eyes if he had not heard the sound of his soft, sleeping sighs. There on the floor, asleep in a corner, sat a big, healthy, purple gorilla. Amazed by what he was seeing, he never thought it might be prudent to consider fleeing. This gorilla was huge. Bob stood there in pure shock, completely unable to move. He jumped a foot as Hank placed a hand on Bob's shoulder. Bob gasped a soft gasp, and then Hank actually asked, "Why, Bob, what's the matter?" Bob stuttered some, but made no sense at all. That didn't stop the sound of his muttering from reaching the beast's ear, and all at once Bob felt much too near. The gorilla opened two deep purple eyes and gave Bob a very serious deep purple glare. At that moment, Bob became aware just how close he was to all that deep purple hair. "Looky here, my purple boy, we have a new member to add to the club of the purple gorilla," Hank said with a smile. The beast stood, and he just kept on going. It was almost like watching him growing. The animal must have been over 7 feet tall, and Hank just stood there as if it wasn't amazing at all. Bob at that point began to feel quite small and felt a deep burning desire to run back out of that hall. Hank must have sensed it, because that moment he mentioned how tired he felt, and Hank suggested ascension. The two men began to walk back down that long hall, and both halted quickly as the beast gave out a thundering call. With deep purple fists, he beat his deep purple chest, and Hank spun back around and chuckled a bit. "Oh, I am so sorry. I forgot his favorite part of this safari." Hank mentioned halting their ascension as he pulled a banana from a packet in his pocket. "Bob," Hank began again, "you must think you're within some sort of a loony bin." That was when, with a thin Cheshire grin, he handed Bob a banana and asked a question that got Bob's attention. "What do you say, Bob? Can you comprehend? Before we ascend, would you, could you, like to make a new friend?" Bob took the fruit, and down that hall he did look, arm outstretched, though I know you might, well, seem this most far-fetched. Bob got real close, and he saw as he handed over the meal, the gorilla revealed a side that seemed most genteel. That banana he did peel with complete tenderness, and not even an ounce of aggressiveness. Bob stood there in awe by what he saw. The gorilla sat flat on his bottom and ate while using his purple knee for a plate. As the ape gently peeled and ate his fruit, Bob thought he looked like a child in a big purple suit. At that moment, Bob felt quite proud to be a member of the deep purple crowd. "Good night, Purple Boy," Bob whispered as he walked back up the hall the same way he had entered. Bob turned to Hank and asked, "Might I invite you to recite tonight the tale that must go with having an adult male gorilla in some sort of underground jail?" With that question asked, Hank sighed, and a sad smile crossed his face. "It's not a jail. It's his hiding place. In any case, Purple Boy has always been there, at least as long as I've lived here. I remember the day that my dad got too old to walk down those stairs. Though it was really hard for him to admit, I suppose. He tossed the keys at me and I watched them fly through midair. When I caught those keys, that's when I knew I had become the guardian of all that deep purple hair. I've never regretted it, not even a bit. You see, Bob, to me, he's no monster. He's just my best friend. I was never lucky enough to find me a wife to walk with me through this life, so therefore," Hank paused and smiled an even sadder smile, "therefore, neither do I have a child." With that said, Hank brushed a tiny teardrop away and he continued, "Those keys have no one to catch them in all that midair, so I just keep hoping someone will come along who will care. These old knees, they're not done just yet. At least for now, I can still make it down. Say, Bob, I was wondering, could a nice guy like you ever be enticed to buy a place like this if it were to have an extremely small asking price?" Surprised by his question and not knowing just how to answer, Bob thought of his home back in Moose Feather. Could he? Would he ever consider moving his couch and his favorite purple wool sweater? Without waiting any longer for Bob to answer, Hank simply, yet sadly, just muttered, "Bob, my new friend, your surprise visit was for me just what that old doctor did order. It gets awfully lonely being the one and only living out in the middle of all this foggy nothing." Hank gave Bob a blanket and a pillow. As a very tired Bob lay down on Hank's comfy couch cushion, he couldn't stop thinking about Hank's very intriguing question. Even more so, as he lay there, Bob continued to wonder about a big purple someone that was sleeping just a stairway below him. Bob tossed and he turned till he finally gave up. Bob leapt out off of the couch and he ran to the back of the house. He opened the hatch and struck a long match. He lit the candle and held it by its golden ring-like handle. He raced down the stairs to get one more glimpse of the beast with all the deep purple hairs. Down, down Bob walked with his candle. He couldn't see very far in front of him, so he held out the golden ring-like handle. He held it out as far as he could and walked quite slowly. Bob, you see, was feeling quite lonely. Lonely for anyone who could give him the courage to keep this walk going. Just a moment ago, Bob had felt so bold, but a moment ago, he had also forgotten how cold and how dark it does get in Hank's dark, cold, clammy abyss. He found the courage to continue walking while listening around for any sound that could be alarming. Then Bob caught a glimpse of the flickering wick that hung from the brick above thick bars of steel that contained a beast that had seemed most genteel. Finally, he was close enough to see his new friend. There he sat alone on the floor of Hank's hallway's end. Purple Boy was staring off into space. Bob thought he might be dreaming of some better place, some place with lots of green where he is king of his jungle, some place without bars where he can stare up at the stars. Purple Boy turned to see Bob over his big purple shoulder. The gorilla looked at Bob, but didn't stand. He just reached out a big purple hand. Remembering the rule, the one simple rule, Bob resisted the temptation by keeping both hands very tight-fisted. With this, the gorilla pulled back his hand, but he looked awfully sad. Bob thought it must be horrible to live a life so deplorable, to never be touched, but he kept his hands tightly clutched and left this magnificent beast untouched. Bob sat down on the floor and picked up 2 pebbles, and with them Bob began to juggle. Purple Boy found this most amusing and began adjusting his big purple bottom to get a better view for watching this amazing Bob juggling. Then something happened, something quite horrible. Bob lost control of one little pebble. As the pebble flew through the air, Bob instinctively reached out to grab it. Purple Boy reached at the very same instant. Their hands collided, and then Bob decided he must have been insane to enter this gorilla's domain. Now I must say, for an animal of such size, this gorilla was surprisingly swift, and in another split second, that huge body he did lift. It was a truly astonishing spectacle to see this animal ripping through thick bars of steel that Bob had assumed were unbendable. As quick as he could, Bob jumped to his feet and he began retreating his quickest retreat. Bob raced up the hall and jumped up the steps, and he could hear the gorilla beating his chest. Up through the hatch and out through the kitchen door. Bob nearly fell as he skidded on Hank's shiny wood floor. Bob ran out of Hank's house and ran back through the fog bank. He wished he could have said thanks, or at least had said sorry. Sorry for breaking his one rule that will now take a small army to stop this beast from harming. Heaven knows there was no time for stalling. In a heartbeat, Bob got his car running, only to look up and see the beast coming. But the great gorilla was too late. Bob had already managed to escape. Bob's car, even with a flat tire, was much faster, and he hoped Purple Boy would run back to his master. Bob was now more concerned about his flat tire situation, so he turned into a local service station. As they fixed his tire, Bob's thoughts were of Hank and how much he had enjoyed their conversation. Bob knew he hadn't shown proper appreciation to Hank for having such consideration for Bob during this whole flat tire situation. As Bob was pondering this, he noticed some folks pointing off in the distance. Bob wasn't prepared for this gorilla's persistence. These folks were still trying to figure out what they were seeing, but Bob's only thought was fleeing. He very quickly handed the station attendant some money so he could quickly keep going. Watching in the rearview mirror, he saw the look of pure fascination on the faces of the folks at the service station. Pure fascination as they saw a purple gorilla, with great determination, run swiftly past them. Bob knew gorillas had an amazing sense of smell, but he still couldn't very well tell how he had been able to run for so long a spell. Once again, Bob did a fond farewell to this place where the purple beast did dwell. He assumed he must have, when he touched him, rang for the gorilla a sort of dinner bell. That's silly, Bob said to himself. Logically speaking, gorillas don't like meat eating. Then Bob saw a sign, and he let out a small sigh. You've but 2 miles till you reach the town of Moose Feather. If he was to be eaten by a meat-eating purple gorilla, at least he could do it in Moose Feather, while sitting on his couch wearing his favorite purple wool sweater. Bob finally saw his little house that sat amongst the trees. Stepping out of his car, Bob felt a wonderful fresh breeze and fumbled with his keys. Tired and scared, he felt quite weak in the knees. He was so horribly tired after all that had transpired, he just couldn't run any more, so he locked his already blocked wooden front door. With an overwhelming feeling of dread, he ran upstairs and dove under his bed. That's when he heard a huge, horrible noise, the sort of noise you might expect when a door and a 7-foot purple gorilla intersect. He heard the sounds of huge whiffs as Purple Boy sniffed. The beast sniffed the air, knowing darn well Bob was somewhere in there. Bob had now fallen into deep, deep despair as he listened to those huge sniffs of air. Bob began to prepare by closing his eyes in a nice morning prayer. Bob heard the sounds of giant purple feet walking, and he knew it was he this giant purple beast was stalking. Bob opened his eyes just in time to see a purple gorilla arrive. The gorilla walked directly to Bob's bed. Bob closed his eyes tightly with a deep feeling of dread. The gorilla caught Bob's scent, so down he did bend, to look under the bed in search of Hank's new friend. The gorilla stretched out one long forefinger, and for a moment he did linger. Looking very scary, he very intently and also very gently gave a not-so-brave Bob a tiny finger wave, ever so gently, while also still most intently he gave Bob a quick flick with his big purple digit. In pure delightment, the gorilla plopped down with much excitement. The gorilla rolled as he laughed with such glee. Bob no longer felt the sudden need to flee. Bob heard the sound of a third soul enter his room. "Bob, where are you? Don't be afraid. Purple Boy will not harm you." Bob watched Hank's feet enter the room, and Hank bent down to take a look at Bob too. "Bob, are you okay? I am so sorry. I should have explained, so this wouldn't have been so alarming. Someone, somewhere, they taught Purple Boy to play tag. I used to play with him every day. Now, well, truth be told, I'm just too darn old." He must have been so excited when he thought you invited him to a good game of tag. Then when you ran, oh, Bob, you can't even imagine. He must have thought he had died and went to some sort of purple gorilla heaven. It's all my fault. You thought you were under assault. I must remember to always explain his favorite game. Purple Boy dragged Bob out from under his bed and patted him gently on top of his head. He hugged Bob really tight, and they spent the rest of the night playing tag in the forest by the moon's light. Hank and his purple gorilla went back home, and Bob felt so awfully alone. Eventually, Bob sold his house in moose feather. He even moved his couch in his favorite purple wool sweater. Bob went to live with Hank, and the three became the best of friends. The wonderful days on the farm turned to months and then years. It appeared the day Hank had always feared was now drawing near. Bob watched Hank pretend over and over again that those steep steps weren't a strain and that they didn't cause him great pain. On his very last visit, Hank chose to expose to Bob one last, very important secret. "I want to show you something, my dear friend. Come with me one more time to the hallway's end." Hank pointed an old crooked finger to the wall behind the purple creature. "Can you see that red scribbling on that small rock that looks like a block? One day I came down here. The store down the block had some overstock, so I had bought a cuckoo clock. It was 4 o'clock, which was a very odd time for me to visit. Each day at 4 o'clock I'm usually still out with the flock. I was just so anxious to show him my new clock. Anyway, to my shock, my purple boy was not sitting by his little rock that looked like a block. I was filled with fright. For the first time in all of my life, he was nowhere in sight. Then that crease in the rock opened. This crease was no crease at all. It was a door I had never noticed before. Purple Boy backed out, and I saw he was holding something that was holding him right back. It was 2 tiny baby purple gorilla hands. These baby hands were tightly holding on to his fur. Purple Boy so gently was attempting to transfer transfer the baby that didn't want to let go of his purple papa's fur. He passed his precious baby to two other purple hands that were waiting. Whatever's back there, I promise you this, he wants no one to know his crease exists. He died to protect it, and because of that, I have always rejected my longing desire to inspect it. So I ask you, Bob, on behalf of my purple best friend, because he has no voice of his own, I ask you to respect him enough to help him keep his crease a secret. I must ask you to always help him to conceal it. Bob kept their secret, and he stayed his whole life. He even made Old Lady Parsons' daughter his wife. Now Purple Boy, Bob, Bob's children, and even Bob's wife play tag every weekend by the moon's light. I'm Gina Bell, and I'm a storyteller.